Hey there, John Morris here, johnmorrisonline.com. Welcome back to another episode of The John Morris Show. This one, we're going to get into a login script, and really what I want to do is get to the nuts and bolts of how login actually works. So what it means to be logged in, how to accomplish it as a developer, how to log out. And we're doing this with sessions. So this is a session-based kind of login script. Before I get into that, a couple things. One, I do a weekly sort of AMA on Friday, so the Friday AMA where you can ask me anything. It's not a live thing, be pre-recorded, but you can ask me any questions that you may have. They're code related, career related, even life related if necessary, and I will try to answer those on Fridays. So if you have a question regarding anything, go ahead and leave that in the comments, or you can head over to the channel page and click on the community tab and leave it there as well, and I'll try to answer those every Friday. And then also be sure to check out those episodes because there's generally lots of good questions coming through. Maybe something that you have been wanting to ask or have thought about that gets answered there, so be sure to check those out. Also, the whole idea for this login script came up from a course that I recently released, which is a full-fledged login script where we interact with the database. We have a password reset. We have a remember me feature. We have user registration. We create sort of a object-oriented sort of class to deal with our logins and prevent SQL injection, all that sort of thing. So it's a full-fledged sort of login script course tutorial with access to all the source code for that I just recently released. If you want to get access to that, you can go to johnmorrisonline.com/login script, and you can see all the different options for getting a hold of that over there. As a listener of this show, you can also use the coupon code JMO on my store site for 20% off anything over there, which includes this login script course and tutorial. So again, johnmorrisonline.com/login script for those details. All right, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and then jump into how this exactly works. So first, let me show you how this login script actually works. It's pretty straightforward. We have just a regular sort of HTML form here, and I enter my username and my password, and I hit enter. And you can see it says, "Welcome home, John. John, you are logged in. Hooray." Click here to log out. So I am logged in. If I reload this page, you can see I still get the home page. If I click log out, now I'm getting the login page again. And so I continue to get that. So I definitely have a state of being logged in and a state of being logged out. And that's what I want to show you how to do and really get to the core of what being logged in and logged out actually means. So a little bit of setup here. So I have this PHP file here called app data. That's just where that's stuff that I need for the tutorial and for the system, the IDE that I use just to ease things a little bit. There's several things in there, and some of the things I don't necessarily want to display publicly. So I'm not going to show that, but there is a constant called app root that is also created in that app data file there. So when you see app root, it actually comes from that app data file. You could put it in the config file here, but I've went ahead and put it in that because it will not be included. Some of the data that's in there will not be included in the source code download. And I'll talk about how you can get the source code, or where you can get the source code here in just a little bit. All right, so with that said, we've got require app data in here. We've got our config file. Now what I've done here, because I really want to focus on the login part and keep this as simple as possible, is instead of creating a database and kind of going through all of that and all that explanation, the concept of logged in and logged out doesn't really change based off of whether you're using a database or not. All that really changes in that sense is hashing passwords and then verifying those hashes when they come out. But either way here, you're verifying passwords. So once the password is verified, then that's when we actually get into logging someone in with a session or not. And that's what I really want to show you. So we have this users array here, and this is representing our data. Again, this could be data in a database. This could be data in a flat file like this. Kind of however you want to do it. But you can see it's a multi-dimensional array. So we have an array of these different users, essentially is what these represent. And we have an ID, a username, and password for each one. So pretty straightforward. The other thing we have is this functions file. And in it we have one function in array R meaning recursive. This is basically for looping through our, this is so we can essentially search this array here. So if you were using this in a database sense, then you wouldn't need this function in array R here. All it does is loop through each one of the users, and then it checks, because it's a multi-dimensional array, it uses in array to check to see if the item that we're searching for exists in that array. And if it does, it returns the item. So we actually, if we find a user, it actually returns this whole array of data about the user, because we'll need that. And if not, then it returns false. So I'm going to go ahead and close that one because that's pretty straightforward. We may look at users again a little bit later, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that open. But I want to head over here to index.php and I want to show you what's going on here. So this is the main verification sort of routine or code that we're going to be using. So it's pretty straightforward, and this would be something that any page that you want to have, make sure someone's logged in for, you would want to have this code on. So what we're doing is we're checking to see if this session variable user ID is set. So we're just going to check and see if it's even set in the first place. And then if it is, I'm setting user ID equal to that simply for ease of use, so I don't have to keep typing all this out. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use our inArrayR function that we created, and we're going to pass in the user ID, and we're going to see if that user ID, so whatever is set in our session, exists in our users table. Now this, or in our users array. Now this is something that's a little different than a lot of the tutorials I see, and maybe I'm being too much of a stickler here, but you know, if a lot of them you'll see they just don't have this part where they actually check for the user. They'll just check to see if the session is set, and then they'll assume sort of a login at that point. I like to always check and make sure that the user actually exists before I do that. Now you could do that at a later point too, but I like to just do it right at this point because you know, especially if we start to abstract this out into a larger application like we do in the full course, then you know, if you can't find the user at this point, there's really not any sense in kind of going on or doing anything more at that point. I mean, here we're going to display the login form, but you know, if you can't find the user, you can't really do anything other than display the login form. So I like to check and actually see if the user exists right at this point. So if the user exists, then we're going to store. Remember, it returns that item. It returns that array from our config file. This right here, as that's what it returns. That's what that function returns. So user will be the array of that data. So we'll have access to our user data. This here is typical header sort of HTML stuff. I'm not going to spend any time on that. And then down here, we're running a simple check. This is really kind of the thing that changes the interface. So we're going to check and see if a user is empty or not. Because if that user didn't exist, this is going to be set to false. And so or there could be something where maybe it did exist, but it was empty. I mean, we use empty just as kind of a catch-all because it'll catch both those scenarios. So we're going to check and see if it's empty. If it's empty, right, if user doesn't exist, then we're going to do a couple things. First off, we're going to destroy any session that might exist. The reason that is because it is possible with the way this is set up that the user ID could be set. So you could have session user ID set. But when we check to see if the user exists in our users table, or our users, in this case, array, that user could not exist. So you could have a user set in the session, but not have it exist in your user's data. So if the user is empty, whatever this session that's set up here, we want to make sure and destroy that session, because it doesn't make any sense to have a session up and active that doesn't have any sort of proper user data. So we're going to destroy the session, and then we're going to include our login form, because we're obviously at this point not logged in. Of course, if this all exists, if the session ID is set and we check for our user, the user exists, this is going to not be empty. So then we'll get our else statement, and we're going to include home.php. Okay, so this is basically the page that does the switching. The index.php checks to see if the user is logged in, and by logged in, what that actually means is that this session variable that we've specified that we're going to check exists, and that user exists in our data, in our array, or in a table if you're using a database. So again, it's going to check and see if that's all set, and if so, it's going to display a logged in page. If not, it's going to display a login form. So that is logged in and logged out, essentially. That's what this means here. It really comes down to a session variable. So now with that said, we can go ahead and take a look real quick at login and home.php. So login is pretty straightforward. It's just a simple form. It passes the data to process.php, uses the post method. It's a username, it's a password, and a submit button. So pretty straightforward. Home is welcome home. And then here, just kind of showing you that, again, you have access to that user data because we specified user right here. This is in a global namespace. And so over here on our home page, we have access to that user data. So we can echo out the username or any data about that particular user. Again, the more complex your application gets, you'll have more data available for that particular user that you could then work with. And then we have our link to log out here, and that's logout.php here. And if we look at logout.php, all we're doing here is we're doing ultimately a session destroy, and then we're doing a redirect back to our home page. So that's why when we come here and we enter our username and password and we get logged in, so this is the logged in state, and we click log out, we go back to this login page here because we destroy the session. So now that session variable is no longer going to exist, and we redirect them back to index.php. So now they're good. This is going to do all of its checking starting all over again. Okay, so with all that, then the last thing that we have is we have our actual processing form that we're going to process our login. So this is actually the form that handles the login and checks whether or not the passwords match. So we're including config, we're including functions, we're doing session start, because if we get a successful match in our password, then we need to set our session variable. So we're going to check and see if the post data, if it's empty or not. If it's not empty, or if it is empty, then we're going to, that'll trigger this else statement, and we're just going to do a die here. Now again, the more advanced your application gets, you could have more advanced handling and so forth, but here I just want to kind of keep it simple, so we're just going to say die. So basically, if you try to visit this page, process.php directly, you're going to get this die script because there was no post data that was submitted. Next, we're extracting the post data. This basically just takes the elements in the array and turns the key into a variable name, and then the data set for that variable is the value of that element. So basically each element in the array will now be set to a variable, and that variable, what the data for that is set to, is what's in the value. Okay, so that's what extract does. You can look that up too if you want to see a little bit more examples of exactly what extract does. That's a fairly common PHP function. And then now that we have that, we're going to again check in array R here, and we're going to check to see if we're going to check it by username. Okay, and so we're going to check to see if that, because we had our username passed in our login form, we don't have the user ID at this point because that's not what we asked for in the login form. We just asked for username and password. So that's what we have access to. So we're going to check to see if that username exists in our users table, just like we did before. If it does, or whatever the response from that is, we're going to set that equal to user here. And then we are going to check to see if the user password that's in our file is equal to the password that was submitted. So remember, extract is what creates this password variable, this username variable and this password variable. So this is what's actually from our post data right here. And so we're going to check that against what's in our, in this case, our array from our config file, or it would be your database, etc. Now here we're doing a straight up match, just because I'm keeping this part of it simple. But obviously, if you're doing in this database, when the user registered, you would hash their password using hash password or password hash. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly which one, but there's a built-in PHP function that'll hash it for you. You can use that, and then you can use verify password to verify that, and it'll do the check for you. So you would be running that here if you're interacting with the database. Again, here I'm just keeping it simple. So we're checking to see if the passwords match. If they match, then we are going to set our session variable. We're going to set session user ID equal to the ID of the user that we grabbed from our flat file. So we basically queried our users array by username for our user data, and then stored that. And so this user variable here now has user ID, username, and password. And so now we can use the ID to set the session user ID equal to user ID. If that doesn't, if both of these fail, we're actually not going to do anything, because the only thing that matters in terms of our login is setting this session user ID. So we're only going to set it if we pass both these if checks. If we don't, we're not going to do anything, because at the end of this, we're going to redirect to our login page, or to our index.php. And if this session variable is not set, we already know that index.php is going to display the login form. So basically what happens is if we submit, let me submit a wrong information, we're going to end up right back on our login page like this. Now again, that's not necessarily the most ideal way of handling bad logins and so forth. You'd obviously want to display messages and such, but I think you get the base idea of how logging in actually works and how you do it. So the basic concept of logging in is that they enter a username and password. We check to see if that username and password matches what we have stored on our end. If it matches, we set a session variable, and then on every page we want to protect, we check to see if that session variable is set and if that user exists in our data. And if so, then we display the logged in page and maybe use some of the user data in it. If it doesn't, then we display our login form again. So that's the basic nuts and bolts of what login is. So hopefully that gives you some sense of how to go about doing and handling your logins. Obviously, as I mentioned in the full course that I did on this, we go full out, remember me, password reset, full on database, the whole kit and caboodle. So if you want to check that out, again, that's johnmorrisonline.com/login script. All right, that'll do it for this episode. Appreciate you watching. If you liked the episode, be sure to like it. Subscribe if you haven't. If you do subscribe, be sure to hit that bell button. Also, if you want to get access to the source code for this specific tutorial, you can head on over to johnmorrisshow.com/242. All the source code download for the source code will be available over there. There's also subscribe links for all the different places you can subscribe to the show and so forth. And if you click the Start Here link, you can get access to Module 1 of my PHP course. I'll give you that if you'll leave me an honest review of the show over on iTunes. I'd appreciate that. But again, johnmorrisshow.com/242 for the source code. So like I said, thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.